social psychology is different from sociology, and a lot of people get sociology and social psychology confused. And I think it's really important to understand what it is that we're studying as we go in, and what it is and what it isn't. Okay, so anthropology is the study of culture. Sociology is the study of groups of people and how those group behaviors work. Okay, social psychology is less concerned with social situations in the objective sense. So this is more where sociology comes in. Okay, so sociology is looking at more of these kind of social situations and how groups interact and affect behaviors as a whole. Okay, so looking sort of groups as a whole. Social psychology is more concerned about how people understand what's going on around them and how that impacts them. Okay, so they are interested in the subjective experience, but there's a lot of objectivity in social psychology, but they're really interested in what we call the construal. Now, the construal this is a definition that I want you guys to really know. So this is a good one to write down and put in your notes. So a construal is the way in which a person is going to perceive, comprehend, and interpret their social world. So a construal is the way in which a person is going to perceive, comprehend, and interpret their social world. So it's how they are viewing what is going on around them. It's how they're understanding the world around them. Okay, the construal is probably one of the most important concepts in social psychology, because it's all about what are you seeing, feeling, how are you acting in response to those around you. Okay, so all about the construal. How are we interpreting our social environment? How are we interpreting others' actions? How are we interpreting others' behaviors? And you know what? Sometimes we are wrong and we misinterpret things. And I don't know about you, but I do it. And it's like, oh, okay. Sometimes I'm notified that I misinterpreted that. And sometimes I carry on my little life and I never have any idea that I've just misinterpreted that social situation. Okay. So the idea behind this, though, is understanding why people interpret situations certain ways. Okay. Now, how else can we study the social situation and social influence? Okay. Well, of course, there are journalists and they report on people's behaviors and they report on how people act. They use social media, for example. Social critics also use social media as a platform to talk about human behavior. We have instant experts, which I don't know about you, but I see daily on social media like Facebook or Meta or whatever we're calling it these days. And it's like these individuals are people who think that they know everything about behavior, and they think that they have identified all of the parts, right? Now, journalists are trained, but they do report sometimes in a biased way. And the whole point of journalism is you're supposed to be an unbiased sort of a source. But of course, we know that it doesn't always work that way. We also know that social critics can be really harmful because sometimes they spread misinformation if they are not careful about how they word certain information. Okay. We're always not cognizant or aware of why we act the way that we do. And even if you make a lot of observations, that doesn't necessarily make you an expert in human behavior. So you have to be kind of careful about different sources. Now, one other source that we have for understanding human behavior in the social context is philosophers. Philosophers have shaped psychology. They are the underpinnings of what psychology was built on, historically speaking. And so they have a great insight, have always had great insight about human behavior and human nature, have really founded what we refer to now as contemporary psychology. But the problem is that philosophers don't agree all the time. right? They don't always agree on the root of behavior. They don't always agree on why we behave certain ways. And so this is not, we can't just rely on philosophy to understand human nature. We must look at human behavior in a scientific way. And philosophers do a lot of great observatory, types of things and observations and thinking exercises and thinking through things. But in order to really understand behavior, what we need to do is actually experiment. We need to develop explanations through empirical work, through doing experiments, through doing controlled observations, being able to manipulate specific variables in an experimental study setting, and then have these ideas that these hypotheses, be able to test these hypotheses, doing testable things, and then be able to verify if that behavior is in fact true or not. And in any kind of science, anytime you use a scientific method in any kind of science, whether it's biology, whether it's chemistry, you can't prove anything in science. All you can do is you can disprove and you can provide evidence for. The only place that you can prove is math. That's the only area that we can actually have proofs. Because even in a perfect world or perfect situation where you have a perfect experiment, okay, that's still not perfect because there's no such thing as perfection in the world. So it's even a flawed experiment if you have an absolutely perfect experiment. So we have to be really careful about how we design our experiments so that we make sure that we have something that's really, really valuable and something that we can test and identify what it is that we found. So in social psychology, that's the process that we use. In social psychology, we set a goal out and we try to find objective answers to important questions. We have a process that we identify a question that can be answered. We then do experimental work using the scientific method and different research methods and methodologies in order to be able to come to these conclusions. So here are a couple of examples of what we can look at as a social psychologist. So these are the kinds of questions that we can ask. What are the factors that cause aggression? Why do people act aggressively in these situations, right? How can we reduce prejudice? How can we, so you can design a study where you actually have a system in place where you have a program to measure prejudicial thoughts and behaviors prior to the program, and then you do a training, and then you measure the same thing at the end. So it's a kind of a pre and post test to see how prejudiced they are after the training. And then if they have gotten better, if the prejudicial thoughts or feelings and behaviors are reduced, then you can say that program was successful in reducing prejudice. So again, looking at this from the scientific empirical lens, we can ask these questions and then answer them through experimental work. We can ask what are the variables involved in two people falling in love or liking each other? What situations happen where you can actually replicate the feeling of liking someone when you aren't even in that situation to begin with. And you can actually replicate that feeling of exhilaration by scaring somebody and having someone else present. And then they actually misattribute that feeling into liking that person or even love. So dating shows, perfect example. You can have situations where you set people up into certain contexts and actually get them to feel differently about a person than if they were in a different situation. And these are all really interesting ways to manipulate behavior, but also to understand how behavior works, right? We can also look at political advertisements and see what works and what doesn't, what sways people's viewpoints. We can look at products and say, what would be more likely a person to want to purchase this product, and design advertisements built around, what people want to choose. And you can influence how much they like their own choice. Okay. And we're going to talk all about this in this class, just kind of a preview, but there are certainly things that we can look at to understand how people make these choices, and then the thought process behind that decision. So looking at what is the difference between social psychology and personality psychology. So we're going to talk a little bit more about differences between sociology, social psychology, personality psychology. Personality psychologists are very interested in individual characteristics. They are interested in the traits and individual differences of what makes us unique. Okay. Now, the difference between social psychology and personality psychology is that personality psychology is not super interested in social influence. Okay. They want to look at the individual characteristics. They want to see kind of almost like in a vacuum how people are impacted or act based off of these particular traits. So they're interested in people and they're interested in the individual. Same thing as social psychologists are interested in the individual, but social psychologists are interested in the social influence aspect, whereas personality psychologists are interested in specific traits. What makes people different from one another? Okay, but it completely ignores the fact that social influence plays a really powerful role in how people behave and act, regardless of what their personality traits are, and sometimes in addition to what their personality traits are. So looking at them separately isn't the whole picture. Social psychologists are interested in explaining social behavior in terms of how the social situation is influencing that behavior and those thought processes, how that shapes how a person acts. And so remember, it all comes down to the construal, how a person is interpreting the situation, how it is construed by the individual, and how that influences the people around them. And what we're going to talk about really in reference to this is why some, for example, groups of people do things like cults, follow a leader, and then decide to do things like commit suicide or go into isolation or something in reference to specific behaviors that we see that people do kind of individually, but as a group. Okay, so just kind of looking further into the difference between a personality psychologist and a social psychologist. A personality psychologist might look at this picture and say, okay, there are some interesting things here. Okay. So what's the first thing you notice about this picture? What's something that stands out to you about this particular picture? And we can look at the individuals, sort of like what is the person? Okay. We see a blue afro. That's definitely somebody standing out. Okay. What else? Yellow shirt, yellow in a sea of blue, right? Okay. So we've got a couple things that stand out to us about this group of people. They're all yes, everybody's concentrating on something, right? So they're obviously watching some sport or some event, right? So if we look at what a personality psychologist might look at this picture and say, wow, okay, everybody's concentrating on something. Okay, let's pick out a person. Okay. Oh, we see somebody with a lighter blue shirt than the darker blue shirt. So it's kind of off, but still blue. Okay. Now let's look at the guy in yellow. Okay. Now, as a personality psychologist, that person's going to jump out at them because they're unique. And of course, we all have unique qualities, but this one is especially unique because it's standing out. So a personality psychologist might say, well, that person in the yellow shirt, what traits do you think that person might have in order to wear this yellow shirt in a sea of blue? So we all know personality traits can be things like shy. You could be outgoing. You can be funny. These are all, different kinds of traits you could have. You could be narcissistic. You could be friendly. Any sort of thing to describe. Okay. So somebody says confident. Okay, rebellious. So a personality psychologist would be interested in what makes that person in the yellow shirt different than all the people around him. And so we might say that person must be quite confident, probably not shy, because a shy person would have a lot of attention put on them for wearing a probably an opposing color shirt in a wrong side of the bleachers, right? Another person might look at the person in the blue afro and say, well, that person's probably not shy, again, because there's attention drawn to them. And so you could look at this group and say, well, there's this person on the very end, who's right here. Okay, maybe she's shy because she's sitting on the end, kind of away from everybody. Her body language is a bit protected. Maybe this person right here might be rather shy. Her arms are in. She's wearing a hat. She's covered. And so a personality psychologist would be picking out all the people and thinking about the traits that make those individuals unique. Whereas a social psychologist would be saying, what's going on here in terms of the context? What's going on here in terms of how people are acting? So this person right here, okay, this person in the yellow shirt, yeah, he might be rebellious. Okay, that's a trait, but how is he impacted by the people around him? Notice he's not looking where everybody else is looking. Notice he seems to be concentrated on a different area. Is it that he's uncomfortable? Are the people around him making him uncomfortable? Perhaps because he's on the wrong side of the bleachers. Okay. Are people, if we were to look at this as a video, are people looking back at him and giving him dirty looks? Are people ignoring him? How does that make him feel? And how is that going to make him make his next move? Right. And so all of these things are things that social psychologists would be interested in, because it is based on how this guy in the yellow shirt is construing the situation, interpreting the situation, then how he's going to act given the people around him. Okay. So he might not hoop and holler and all that because he is an opposing side, and he might get looks or threats because he is going for the opposing team. So how we perceive our safety, how we perceive the people around us, and if they are going to hurt us or if they're going to ignore us, is going to impact how we behave. Now, looking at social psychology in reference to other social sciences, okay, it a lot of times comes down to that level of analysis. And so social psychologists are interested at that level of analysis at the individual level in the context of the broader social situation, whereas other social sciences are interested in broader areas influence, like the social influence as a whole, the economic influence, political, historical factors, and how that influences society. So sociologists would be more interested at this level of analysis of how society is impacting a group of people. Okay. Whereas social psychologists interested at the level of analysis at the individual level and how an individual is interpreting the situation around them, there's a lot of overlap here. Okay. I'm not saying that they're completely two separate, mutually exclusive fields. There's a lot of overlap here, but social psychologists are more interested at the individual level, whereas sociologists are more interested at the group level. And kind of as a whole, how that group is going to be impacted. And so the goal of social psychology is all about what are these universal properties of human nature that makes us susceptible to social influence? Why is it that an individual is going to change their behaviors based on the presence or perceived presence of people? The wedgie talk doesn't matter what religion or social class or culture or whatever group you're in, okay? If you're going to pick the wedgie alone, you're going to pick the wedgie alone, right? If you're in a group of people, okay, now there is going to be some influence of culture, some influence of class and social class and all, of course, it's always there. But social psychologists are more interested in what makes us susceptible to changing our thoughts and behaviors based off of the presence or perceived presence of people around us, okay? Sociology is why a particular society or group within a society produces that behavior. So looking at the difference between the two, okay, sociology is looking towards society at large rather than the individual. A sociologist might be interested in social class, social structure, social institutions. Okay. It is trying to understand and seek to explain the properties of societies and how that influences people. Okay. Social psychologists are looking at the universal properties of human nature and what makes a person susceptible to social influence. Okay, so these are the major differences between sociology and psychology. And so really coming down to that level of analysis. Sociologists, society at large. Social psychologists, individuals, based on the context of their construal or interpretation of that social situation. Okay, so is everybody pretty clear on the differences, and they feel confident that they understand these two? And so this final thing is just kind of a picture for us to kind of think about how a psychologist, a social psychologist versus a sociologist might look at this picture and go, what are the dimensions that we can study here? Okay, so we can look at people as individuals. We can look at people from as family units. We can look at class, social class. We can look at careers, occupation. We can look at religion as a perspective. We can look at culture. And these are the kinds of things that we can look at as through a lens of social psychology and say, how are these things influencing that person's individual behavior? By being in this unit, by being around other people, and by being a part of a religion, part of an ethnicity, part of a culture. Okay. And so how are these things influencing a person's behavior and influencing their thoughts? Whereas a sociologist is looking at, let's look at these groups, right? Let's look at these groups together and how this is influencing the religion as a whole, the people of the religion as a whole, looking at how, ethnicity, people of a particular ethnicity are being affected as a whole.